Welcome to today's Coffee House Bible study in Romans. Before we close this section, let me ask you a question that sits at the heart of Paul's entire argument. If humanity is bound by chains of its own making, what hope is left for any of us? In Romans 1:24 through 27, Paul has shown why the Gentile world needs the gospel, because every person, no matter their culture or background, stands under the weight of God's wrath, trapped in passions that imprison rather than free. But this dark backdrop is precisely what makes the gospel shine. Paul isn't trying to crush his listeners. He's preparing them to hear the best news ever given to the human race. The gospel is God's rescue for both Gentiles and Jews. The one power is strong enough to break the chains we forged ourselves and bring us into the life he intended.
Therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men, committing indecent acts, and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error.
As we move into Romans 1:24 through 27, Paul uses a phrase with a sharp judicial edge. God gave them over. In the Greco-Roman world, this was the language of the courtroom. When a magistrate would hand a prisoner over to a jailer or executioner. Paul draws on that imagery to show that God's wrath was not a thunderbolt from heaven, but a solemn judicial act. He hands people over to the very desires they insist on pursuing, allowing those choices to become their own punishment. In the world Paul lived in, the Greek verb paradidomai carried a sharp judicial force. It was the standard courtroom term for handing a prisoner over to a guard or a jailer, delivering someone for punishment, or transferring custody from one authority to another. It's the same verb used when Jesus was handed over to the authorities in Mark 15:15. So when Paul says God gave them over, he isn't describing passive withdrawal. He's invoking the solemn moment when a magistrate formally turns a prisoner over to the consequences of their own actions. Paul repeats the phrase God gave them over 3 times in verse 24, 26, and 28 to create deliberate rhythm of judgment. First to impurity, then dishonorable passions, and finally to debased mind. Each step shows a judicial handing over, as though God transferred them from the custody of the very sins they insist on pursuing. Paul isn't saying God causes the sin. He's showing that God delivers them to the consequences of the path they have chosen, allowing their desires to become their own punishment. In verse 24, Paul shows that one expression of God's wrath is startlingly interior. God gives humanity over to the passions of their own hearts. In Paul's picture, our desires don't simply mislead us, they imprison us. The very lust we chase become the bars of our jail, locking us inside the impulses we refuse to surrender. It's a sobering moment in Romans where God's judgment is an external strike, but an inward captivity. letting the human heart become its own warden. Paul adds a sobering detail when he says, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. In other words, of all the ways that a godless might show itself in human life, Paul highlights human sexuality as the primary arena where rebellion becomes visible. It's not the only expression of a godless worldview, but it is the one humanity most consistently chooses as its signature act of defiance. In Paul's logic, when people erase God from their horizon, the distortion of their body soon follows, and the misuse of sexuality becomes the clearest marker of a deeper spiritual revolt. Paul sharpens the indictment when he says, for they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. It's not only that humanity suppresses the truth of God's existence, Paul insists that we also reject God's moral guidance and ethical teaching. In Paul's view, godlessness is never just an intellectual denial, it's a moral trade-off. People knowingly abandon the truth that leads them to life and embrace a lie that reshapes their values, their choices, and ultimately their worship. This exchange becomes the engine that drives the the downward spiral he describes in the rest of the chapter. Paul continues, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. At this moment, Paul is no longer talking about idolatry in its simple sense of carving statues and bowing down for them. His critique goes deeper. Humanity doesn't just invent new gods, we become the gods we worship. We turn inward, making our own bodies, desires, and impulses the object of devotion. In Paul's logic, the creature we serve is not a carved image, but the self. And the rebellion is expressed when people enthrone their own appetites where the Creator should reign. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. There's a deep irony in that statement. In the very act of making our own bodies our idols, treating desire as our God, we end up degrading ourselves. Paul's point is not that caring for the body is wrong. In fact, a godly life encourages stewardship, honor, and self-care, but when the body becomes the object of worship, the opposite happens. A godless person begins to abuse and diminish the very self they exalt, and the passions they serve become the forces that undo them. Paul writes that their women exchange the natural function for that which is unnatural. When Paul speaks of the natural function, he's referring to the created design of the body and its role in God's ordering of human life. In Paul's worldview, the woman's natural function includes her unique capacity to bear and nurture children, a vocation that he sees as profoundly honorable and life-giving. His point is not about emotional attraction or personal affection. It's about turning away from the created order that includes the remarkable ability to bring new life into the world. For Paul, abandoning the natural function signals a reflection of the divine itself woven into the human body itself. Paul's argument carries a deep irony. He sees the nurturing vocation of women, the patience, tenderness, and shaping influence that mark the raising of children, as one of the most powerful expressions of God's wisdom in creation. In Romans 1, Paul's concern is that when people turn away from God's design, they also turn away from the larger purpose their relationships were meant to embody. His focus is not on condemning individuals, but on showing how rejecting the created order leads to a loss of the life-giving roles and capacities they reflect God's own goodness. Paul adds another layer when he says, the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another. It's striking that Paul does not mirror his earlier phrasing about women. He doesn't say men turned away from the natural function of men. He says they turned away from the natural function of women. That choice of language is deliberate. For Paul, the natural function of the woman is tied to the life-giving design of marriage and the bearing of children. By framing it this way, Paul signals that the rejection he's describing is not merely about desire, it's a turning away from the life-creating partnership God built into the fabric of humanity. In Paul's logic, abandoning the woman's natural function is another marker of humanity stepping away from the generative, life-shaping purposes God intended for marriage and family. Our idiom alert today is degrading passions. Paul now says, for this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions, and this is where his argument reaches its most sobering point. When Paul uses the word degrading, he isn't talking about social labels or cultural judgments. He's describing what happens when a person's choices diminish their own dignity. In Paul's view, when women turn from the created order and when men abandon the natural function of the woman, they step into passions that demean and dishonor the very bodies that God designed with purpose. The tragedy for Paul is that not merely the act itself, but the inward collapse it represents. People lowering themselves, people treating their own bodies in which that fall beneath the honor God intended. In this sense, degrading passions are passions that reduce, diminish, and distort the divine purpose woven into human life. Paul concludes this section by saying, men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of this error. Many Christians have misunderstood this, imagining that Paul is referring to some later physical disease or social consequence. But Paul's point is far more immediate and theological. The penalty is built into the act itself. Think of a nut and bolt. Each has a function, and together they create something secure and life-giving. Two bolts or two nuts cannot fulfill that purpose, and the penalty of that error is simply that nothing can be fastened. Paul applies that same logic to human sexuality. The male and the female bodies are designed with complementary, life-creating function. When people ignore that design, the penalty is not an external punishment, but the inherent lifelessness of a union that cannot fulfill the purpose woven into the human body. In Paul's view, the act itself carries its own consequence because it steps outside the created order that gives human sexuality its generative power. Today, we trace Paul's argument through Romans 1:24 through 27, and saw how the downward spiral of humanity reveals why the gospel is such good news. We learned that God's wrath is expressed not in lightning bolts, but in handing people over to the very passions that imprison them. We saw how rejecting God's truth leads to self-worship, how abandoning the created order diminishes the dignity God built into the human body, and how the due penalty of these choices is found in the lifelessness of unions that cannot fill their created purpose. All of this sets the stage for Paul's larger message. One of us, every one of us, Jew and Gentile alike, is bound by chains of our own making, and only the gospel has the power to break them. Paul adds, what may be known about God is within them, meaning among them, woven into the shared awareness of every human culture. God's existence was not unknown. Every society carries some echo of him, and Paul presses further. God made it evident to them. Here he contradicts the modern idea that faith is believing something that cannot be proven. Paul sees no conflict between faith and reason. Faith rests on facts, on empirical evidence. God himself is embedded in creation. Humanity's problem is not the lack of proof, It is the refusal to accept the proof God has already provided. That's why Paul says they are without excuse. God's wrath is deserved because they unrighteously suppress the evidence that he supplies. As we wrap up today's Coffeehouse Bible study in Romans, remember that Paul isn't finished. The final paragraph of chapter 1 will show us the full weight of what happens when humanity walks away from God's truth, how the handing over reaches its final stage, and why the gospel becomes not just helpful, but absolutely essential. Paul is building toward a moment that exposes the human condition with startling clarity, and it prepares us to see just how desperately we need the grace he announces in the verses ahead. We're building a space for honest, grace-filled discovery. If that sounds like something you want to be a part of, subscribe and click the bell to stay connected. Thanks for watching.